I was still holding my coffee when Victoria leaned back and smiled at her guests. Deshawn's mother was a nurse. You know, the type spent 34 years taking orders, never really getting ahead, but she raised him so. So, one word. That's all 34 years was worth to her. I reached for my purse. I was done. That's when a man at the VIP table stood up. Someone Victoria clearly recognized. Someone whose presence made her smile freeze completely. Before she goes, he said quietly, this room needs to know whose mother that is. And the color drained from Victoria's face, because the man speaking had every reason to be grateful to me, and every reason to destroy her. The kind of Saturday morning Memphis does, best golden light spilling over the rooftops on Beale Street, the air carrying just enough river breeze to make you forget for a moment that anything in the world could go wrong. I had parked 2 blocks from the restaurant and walked the rest of the way I always do when I need a few extra minutes to settle myself. My shoes were sensible. My dress was the blue one I saved for occasions that asked something of me. My purse was pressed against my side, and inside it, underneath my wallet, and my keys, was a small photograph I had tucked in that morning without quite knowing why. Itabena sat above the street, like it had always been there and always would be. Dark wood, low light, the kind of jazz that doesn't ask you to listen. It just fills the room until you realize you've been holding your breath. The hostess smiled at me with the practiced warmth of someone who had been trained to make every guest feel welcome, even the ones who clearly didn't belong. My daughter-in-law, Victoria, a sharp, polished woman in her early 30s who had built her life around the art of making everything look effortless, had reserved the long table by the window. She stood when she saw me, arms open, just wide enough to look like a welcome without actually being one. Carol, her voice was warm in the way that expensive candles smell warm. Designed, deliberate. You made it. Beside her, my son Deshawn, tall, broad-shouldered, wearing a jacket I didn't recognize, turned and gave me the kind of smile that lives somewhere between love and apology. He kissed my cheek, said I looked nice, then stepped back into the orbit of his wife like a man who had long since learned where he was supposed to stand. There were 10 people at that table, colleagues of Victoria's, mostly the kind of people who laugh at the right moments and ask questions they already know the answers to. I was introduced once quickly as Deshawn's mother, and then the conversation moved on without me, the way a river moves around a stone. I sat where I was directed, near the end of the table, far enough from my son that I had to lean forward to hear him when he spoke. The meal came and went in pieces. Plates I recognized and plates I didn't. Conversations about things I had no part in. I smiled when it seemed appropriate. I answered when I was asked. I kept my hands folded in my lap and my back straight the way my own mother had taught me, because some lessons stay in the body long after everything else has faded. And then Victoria set down her glass. She had the kind of stillness that comes right before something lands. The table quieted without being asked to. You know what I was just thinking about, she said, not to anyone in particular, but somehow to everyone. She tilted her head in my direction, with a smile that didn't move past her mouth. Deshawn's mother spent 34 years as a nurse. Can you imagine 34 years of night shifts, taking orders, doing what she was told? A small pause. A smaller laugh. She raised him, though. So, the word dropped into the room like a stone into still water. So, one syllable, wrapped in a smile, delivered with the confidence of someone who had never once been told that their words could cut. The table offered the response. Victoria had clearly expected a ripple of polite laughter, a few nods, the kind of social reflex that asks no questions and takes no sides. I placed my napkin on the table, slowly, deliberately. I reached for my purse. I stood up. The movement was quiet. No scraping chair, no sharp breath. Just a woman in a blue dress rising from a table that had never quite made room for her, doing it with the particular dignity that belongs to people who have spent a lifetime deciding which battles are worth their energy. And that was the moment the room changed. From the far side of the restaurant near the window that looked out over Beale Street, a man stood up from the small VIP table, that had sat quietly apart from the rest of the dining room all morning. He was somewhere in his late 60s, silver-haired, with the kind of presence that doesn't announce itself, it simply arrives. He wore no expression that I could read. He just stood, and in standing, somehow, made every other person in that room go still. He looked at Victoria first. Then he looked at me, and something in his face, something I had no name for, yet shifted in a way that made the air in the room feel different. He moved through the restaurant without hurrying, past the other tables, past the hostess station, past the soft brass of the bar fixtures, catching the morning light. People turned to watch him, the way people turn when they sense that something important is happening, even before they understand what it is. He stopped in front of me. For a moment, he simply looked at me, the way you look at something you were afraid you might never find. Then he reached out and wrapped both arms around me. Not the careful, measured embrace of a stranger, but the kind that belongs to people who have been carrying something for a very long time and have finally found somewhere to put it down. The table behind me had gone completely silent. Victoria had not moved. Her glass was still raised halfway to her lips. The color that had been in her face a moment before had quietly left it. Deshaun sat with both hands flat on the table, his eyes moving between his wife and his mother, and the man who was still holding his mother like she was something precious. When the man finally pulled back, he kept both of my hands in his. His voice, when it came, was steady and low, and carried the particular weight of words that have waited years to be spoken. "I've been looking for you," he said, "for a very long time." The room did not move. Victoria did not speak. And my son, who had spent the better part of the morning carefully avoiding my eyes, could not look away. Let me tell you who I am before I tell you what happened. My name is Carol Jean Simmons. I am 62 years old. I live in a house on a quiet street in Midtown Memphis, Tennessee, where the oak trees are old enough to have seen several generations of the same families come and go, and where the neighbors still wave from their porches in the evening, like it costs them nothing, because it doesn't. I have been a nurse for 34 years. Not the kind of nurse you see in the movies, the ones with the perfect hair and the meaningful glances across gleaming hospital corridors. I mean the real kind. The kind who works the overnight shift at Methodist University Hospital when the rest of the city is asleep, who has held the hands of strangers in the darkest hours of their lives, who has learned that sometimes the most important thing you can do for another human being is simply stay in the room with them. 34 years of sensible shoes and fluorescent lighting. 34 years of 12-hour shifts that stretched into 14 because someone needed one more set of steady hands. 34 years of learning to read a room the moment you walk into it. Not the fancy kind of room with white tablecloths and jazz overhead, but the kind where every second counts, and reading wrong means someone pays a price they can't afford. People used to ask me how I did it, how I kept showing up year after year for work that asked everything and advertised nothing. And the honest answer was one I only gave to people I trusted. I did it because I was good at it. And because being good at something that matters truly matters is its own kind of quiet reward. But there was another reason too. I did it because every night when I came home, no matter how late, no matter how much the shift had taken out of me, there was a man sitting at the kitchen table waiting for me. His name was Marcus Simmons. He was a high school math teacher for 31 years at a school 3 miles from our house, and he had the particular patience that belongs to people who spend their lives explaining difficult things to young minds that aren't yet sure they care. He was not a tall man. He was not a loud man. He did not fill a room the way some men do with noise and presence and the need to be noticed. Marcus filled a room the way good light does, gradually warmly, until you couldn't quite remember what it had looked like before he was in it. We met at a church picnic in the summer of 1985. He had been assigned to carry the folding tables, and I had been assigned to direct people where to put them, which meant we spent the better part of 2 hours arguing politely about spatial logistics in a church parking lot in July. He asked for my number before the potato salad was gone. I gave it to him before the sun went down. We were married the following spring. 38 years. People talk about long marriages, like they are achievements, like longevity alone is the measure of the thing. But what I remember about those 38 years is not the length of them. It is the texture, the particular way Marcus had of listening, not waiting for his turn to speak, but actually listening the way you listen to something you don't want to miss a single word of. The way he remembered small things. The way he brought me coffee in the exact way I liked it, without ever being asked, because somewhere in the early years of our marriage, he had simply paid attention and never stopped. He used to leave notes on the kitchen counter. Not long ones. Just a few words, sometimes. Just one sentence, written in his careful teacher's handwriting on whatever paper was nearby. A receipt, a napkin, the back of an envelope. I still have every single one. There is a particular kind of safety that comes from being loved by someone who sees you clearly. Not the version of you that you present to the world. Not the version that is useful or capable or put together, but the actual you, the one with the worn edges and the quiet doubts and the tired places you don't show anyone else. Marcus saw all of it, and not once in 38 years did he make me feel like any of it was too much. Not once did he let anyone else make me feel that way either. It didn't matter if it was a colleague who spoke over me at a hospital function, or a neighbor who made a remark she thought was harmless, or a stranger in a store who looked at me like I was less than what I was. Marcus had a way of responding to those moments that didn't require volume or confrontation. He would simply move closer to me, place his hand at the small of my back, and speak to whoever it was with the calm, measured tone of a man who had already decided how the conversation was going to end. It was never a performance. It was never done to prove something to me or to anyone watching. It was just the way he was built, the way some people are built for gentleness, the way others are built for speed or strength. He believed without reservation and without condition that I was worth standing beside. For 38 years, that belief was the ground beneath my feet, the thing I walked on without thinking about the way you walk on solid earth, without stopping to consider whether it will hold you. Marcus never let anyone make me feel small. Not once. Not ever. And then he was gone. 4 years ago, on a Tuesday evening in October, everything changed. Marcus had seemed fine that morning. That is the thing about moments like that one, they don't announce themselves. There is no shift in the light, no particular stillness in the air that tells you to pay attention, to hold on to, memorize the ordinary details of an ordinary morning, because you will spend the rest of your life reaching back for them. He had made oatmeal, the kind with the brown sugar and the handful of pecans he kept in a mason jar on the second shelf of the pantry. He had poured my coffee before I asked the way he always did, and left it on the counter with a folded napkin underneath the mug, because the counter had a slight tilt, and he knew the mug would slide without it. I remember thinking, as I pulled out of the driveway that morning, that the oak tree in the front yard had finally turned, all the way gold, the kind of October gold that makes Memphis look like it was painted by someone who loved it. I was 3 hours into my shift when the call came. I will not describe what those next minutes felt like, because some things happen in the body at a level beneath language, in a place where words simply do not reach. I will only say that I moved through those corridors the way I had moved through them for 34 years, quickly, purposefully, one foot in front of the other, and that every step of that walk was the hardest thing I had ever done. He was already in one of the rooms when I reached him. The team was there. Good people. Every one of them colleagues I had worked beside for years. People I trusted with my life and had trusted with the lives of strangers more times than I could count. They were doing everything that could be done. I knew that. I understood in the part of my mind that had spent 3 decades learning the language of emergencies, exactly what each movement meant, and exactly what the numbers on the monitors were saying. I stood beside him and I held his hand. I was still wearing my uniform, the pale blue one with the small coffee stain on the left cuff that I had been meaning to treat for 2 weeks. I remember looking down at that stain at some point during those hours and thinking that it was the most ordinary thing in the world and that the world had no right to still contain ordinary things. Marcus did not speak, but at one point in a quiet moment between one thing and the next, his fingers tightened around mine. Not strongly, just enough. The way you hold on to something when you want to say something that doesn't have words. I held on back. The room had a window that faced west, and I watched the light outside change from afternoon gold to the deep amber of early evening, to the gray blue of a sky that had decided it was done with color for the day. The monitors kept their steady conversation around us. The team moved with the quiet efficiency of people who understood the weight of what they were doing. And then at some point in that gray-blue hour, the numbers changed in a way that didn't change back. The room went quiet in a different way than it had been quiet before. I kept holding his hand. His hand was warm for longer than you would think. That is something nobody tells you, how long warmth stays, how it lingers in the fingers and the palm, like it doesn't quite know yet that it's supposed to leave. I stayed with him until it did. I did not move and I did not look away, and I did not let go until I was certain that every last bit of warmth had passed through my hand and into whatever place warmth goes when a person is done with it. Then I straightened up. I smoothed the front of my uniform with both hands, the way you smooth a tablecloth before guests arrive. I checked that every button was fastened. I tucked a loose strand of hair back behind my ear. I said goodbye to the people in that room, and I thanked them because they had fought hard and they deserved to be thanked, and because Marcus would have wanted me to. Then I walked out of that building across the parking lot and got into my car. I sat in the driver's seat with both hands on the steering wheel and the engine off. The parking lot lights had come on while I was inside, and they cast a particular kind of yellow light over everything, the kind that makes the whole world look like a photograph taken somewhere between one era and the next. I allowed myself exactly 10 minutes. 10 minutes to let my shoulders drop. 10 minutes to press my forehead against the steering wheel and make the kind of sounds that a person makes when the ground they have been standing on for 38 years simply ceases to exist beneath their feet. 10 minutes of honest, unwitnessed falling apart in a parking lot in Memphis on a Tuesday night in October, with my uniform still on and a cold mug of coffee somewhere back at the nurse's station that nobody had thought to throw away. When the 10 minutes were up, I sat back. I wiped my face with the backs of my hands. I started the engine. I held his hand until it was still. Then I folded my uniform carefully, walked to my car, and allowed myself exactly 10 minutes to fall apart. After that, I never cried at work again. In the months after Marcus passed, the house became a different kind of quiet. Not the quiet of early mornings before the neighborhood woke up, or the quiet of Sunday afternoons, when the whole street seemed to agree, without discussion, to simply rest. This was a quiet with texture to it, a quiet that had weight, the kind that settles into the corners of rooms and stays there, and that you become aware of most sharply at the moments you least expect, reaching for a second coffee mug out of habit, or turning to say something to the chair across the kitchen table and finding it empty. I kept working. That was the thing that made sense to me when nothing else did. The overnight shifts at the hospital were in some ways a mercy, because the night asks something of you constantly. And when you are being asked something constantly, you do not have room to sit with your own silence. There were always people who needed steady hands and a calm voice, and someone who would not flinch. I had spent 34 years becoming exactly that person. And so I kept showing up, kept moving through those corridors, kept being useful in a place where being useful was the highest form of presence. The house waited for me when I came home each morning. I learned to make peace with it, the way you make peace with weather, not by loving it, but by understanding that it isn't personal. The quiet wasn't against me. It was just what the house was now, and I was just the person who lived in it. My son, Deshaun, my only child, an architect living in downtown Memphis, with the kind of career that asked most of him and got it called every few days in those early months. He had his father's voice low and measured with that same quality of genuine attention that made you feel when he was talking to you like you were the only thing in the room worth focusing on. He would ask how I was eating, whether I was sleeping, whether I needed him to come over. I always told him I was fine. Some of those times, I was even telling the truth. What I did not tell him was that I had started sleeping with the television on, not watching it, just letting it run in the other room, a low murmur of voices that kept the house from becoming completely still. Or that I had rearranged the kitchen, once moved a few things around, and then moved them all back again 2 days later, because the new arrangement felt like a betrayal of something I couldn't quite name. Grief is not a single thing. That is what people don't understand until they are inside it. It is not a storm that arrives and then passes. It is more like a shift in the ground beneath you, slow, subtle, and permanent. The world looks the same from the outside. You go to the store, you pay your bills, you answer when people ask how you are doing, but the coordinates of everything have changed, and you are constantly quietly recalibrating. About 8 months after we lost Marcus, Deshaun called on a Sunday afternoon with a different kind of tone in his voice. Lighter, almost careful the way people sound when they are carrying something they hope will be received well. He had met someone. Her name was Victoria. She worked in the city in one of the industries that have to do with image and presentation, the kind of work that requires a person to understand at a deep level how things appear to other people. He had known her for 6 months. He wanted me to meet her. I said, of course. And I meant it. They came for dinner on a Saturday in late spring when the dogwoods in the front yard were still holding their last blooms. And the evening air had that particular softness that Memphis gets in May, just before the heat settles in for the summer. Victoria was striking. That was the first thing. Not beautiful in a conventional way, but put together in a way that suggested considerable effort made to look like no effort at all. She wore a silk blouse, the color of cream, and heels that were practical enough to be sensible, but elegant enough to signal that practicality was a choice rather than a necessity. Her handshake was firm. Her eye contact was direct. She complimented the house immediately, said it had good bones, said she loved what I had done with the front garden. Deshaun watched her, the way young men watch the people they love, when those people are meeting someone important with a kind of hopeful vigilance, tracking every exchange, ready to smooth over anything that needed smoothing. I offered them sweet tea and brought out the pound cake I had made that afternoon. Victoria ate a small slice and said it was wonderful, and there was something about the way she said it, the completeness of the compliment, the way it closed the subject, rather than opened it, that I noticed without quite knowing what I was noticing. She asked about my work with the careful interest of someone who has been taught that asking questions is a form of good manners. She listened to my answers with her chin slightly tilted, the way people listen when they are deciding what a thing means, rather than simply hearing it. She was gracious. She was articulate. She did everything right. And somewhere in the back of my mind, in a quiet place I did not examine too closely, that evening, something very small and very still simply waited. I walked them to the door when the evening was over. Deshaun hugged me the way he used to when he was a boy, both arms, no reservation. Victoria turned on the front step and extended her hand again. She shook my hand and smiled, and I told myself that smile was real. I wanted so badly for it to be real. Over the years that followed, I learned something about the way certain people use kindness as a weapon. It is not a loud thing. It does not announce itself. It works slowly, the way water works on stone, not by force, but by persistence, by the steady erosion of something solid into something that fits more conveniently into someone else's choosing. Victoria never said an unkind word to me. That was what made it so difficult to name for so long. The first time I noticed it, we were at a dinner party, at one of Deshawn's colleagues' home in East Memphis. I was near the fireplace, talking to a woman about the garden I had started the previous spring, something real and growing to put my hands into. Victoria appeared at my elbow with that particular grace she had. "I was just telling everyone about Carol's garden," she said warmly, her hand resting briefly on my arm. "She does everything by hand. No landscaper, no design plan. She just goes out there and figures it out as she goes." She smiled at me with what looked like pure affection. "It's so wonderfully instinctive, like folk art, almost." Folk art. I turned those two words over in my mind. Not gardening, not landscape. Folk art, the kind of phrase that places a thing just slightly below the level of being taken seriously. A compliment that is also, if you listen carefully, a quiet and efficient dismissal. I told myself I was reading too much into it. The second time, I was more certain. Deshawn and Victoria had come for Sunday dinner. I had cooked the way I always cooked, slow-cooked greens, cornbread from scratch recipes that had been in our family long enough to have opinions about themselves. Victoria set a bottle of wine on the table and looked at the spread with an expression I can only describe as genuinely fond, the way people look at something they find charming, precisely because it belongs to a world they have moved beyond. "I just love this," she said. "It's so home-style, so unpretentious." She glanced at Deshawn with a small smile. "There's something beautiful about people who cook the old way, before everything got so complicated." Deshawn nodded. He passed the cornbread. He did not say anything. I watched him not say anything. Before everything got so complicated. As if the food on that table, food that carried the hands of women I had loved, was a relic of a simpler era. As if feeding your family with care was something that required an apology. I served the greens. I kept my expression exactly where I had always kept it, in difficult moments, steady open, giving nothing away. The third time, it was just the two of us. Deshawn was running late, and Victoria sat at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee, looking around the room with that evaluating stillness she sometimes forgot to conceal. Her voice was conversational, completely offhand. "You know what I admire about you, Carol?" She wrapped both hands around her mug. "You've never tried to be something you're not. Some women your age, they reach for things that aren't really meant for them. New careers, reinvention." A small laugh. "You just stayed true to who you are. There's a real dignity in that." I turned from the counter and looked at her. She was looking at me with what appeared in every visible way to be sincere appreciation. "Women your age, things that aren't really meant for them. Stayed true to who you are." Each phrase alone was nothing. Together, they formed a sentence whose meaning was as clear as if she had written it on paper and slid it across the table. "You have reached the limit of what you are capable of, and the graceful thing is to accept it." I said thank you. I turned back to the counter. Those moments accumulated the way small debts accumulate, each one individually manageable, collectively ruinous. And the most difficult part was not the words themselves. It was watching what happened to Deshawn. It was gradual. My son did not wake up one morning and decide to see me differently. But I watched over months and then years as Victoria's vocabulary for me became his vocabulary for me. The way he began to preface things, "Mom's very traditional," or "She's not really comfortable with that," as if he were translating me for a world I was no longer quite fluent in. The way invitations stopped coming. The way phone calls grew shorter, more efficient, more like check-ins than conversations. He was not cruel. He loved me. I never doubted that. But love, I was learning, can coexist with blindness. And the blindness that came from living inside Victoria's version of who I was had made him slowly, and without his full awareness, smaller in the way he saw me. And I had let it happen. Every time Victoria reframed me, and I did not push back. Every time I swallowed what I wanted to say and replaced it with something easier. Every time I told myself it wasn't worth the trouble. I had been making myself smaller for years, one quiet step at a time. I stopped correcting her after a while. It was easier to just become what she said I was. 2 weeks before that Saturday morning, Victoria called. That alone was unusual. Victoria did not call me. Not directly, not without reason. Not in the easy way that people call someone they consider part of their daily world. Our communication over the years had settled into a pattern that suited us both. Deshawn as the bridge, the occasional text on a birthday, the polite exchange at family gatherings that lasted exactly as long as it needed to. That was our arrangement, unspoken and mutually understood. So when her name appeared on my phone on a Thursday evening in late September, I looked at it for a moment before I answered. Carol. Her voice was warm, in a way I had learned to read carefully, the way you read weather, not for what it is, but for what it might mean. I've been thinking about you. How are you doing? I told her I was fine. I asked how she was. Wonderful, she said. Actually, that's why I'm calling. Deshawn just got some really exciting news at work, and we want to celebrate. A brunch, nothing too big, just some close friends, a beautiful place downtown, and we'd love for you to be there. We'd love for you to be there. I had been around that phrase long enough to know that the word love does a great deal of work in sentences like that one. Sometimes it means exactly what it says. Sometimes it is doing the work of several other words that are less presentable in polite conversation. Of course, I said. Just tell me when and where. She gave me the details with the efficiency of someone who had already decided everything and was simply informing rather than inviting. Then she added in a softer tone, I really think it'll be good for all of us to spend some time together. We've been so busy lately. We've been so busy. I said that sounded lovely. She said she was so glad. We said goodbye with the practiced warmth of two people who have learned to perform closeness without requiring it. I set the phone down on the kitchen counter and stood there for a moment, looking at nothing in particular. There was nothing specific I could point to. No single word she had said that didn't sit right. No phrase I could hold up to the light and identify as the thing that bothered me. It was more like a shift in air pressure, the kind that happens before a change in weather, that your body registers before your mind catches up. Deshawn called 2 days later. His voice was different in a way that was difficult to name precisely. Not cold, not unkind, but tighter than usual, the way a person's voice gets when they are carrying something they haven't fully decided how to carry. We talked about the brunch. He confirmed the details Victoria had already given me, mentioned the restaurant, said he was looking forward to seeing me. I asked him how work was going. Fine, he said. Busy. I asked if everything was all right. There was a pause. Not long, just a half-second longer than it should have been. Everything's great, Mom, he said. It'll be good to see you. After we hung up, I sat in the living room for a while. In the early evening, quiet, the television off. For once, the kind of stillness that invites you to think whether you want to or not. I turned the two conversations over in my mind, the way you turn something in your hands when you're trying to figure out what it's made of. I did not reach a conclusion. I told myself there was no conclusion to reach. The Saturday morning arrived, the way October mornings do, in Memphis, cool and clear, the sky, a pale blue that looks like it was freshly made, the air carrying the particular smell of fallen leaves and something distant and smoky that never quite has a name, but always feels familiar. I was awake before my alarm. I lay in bed for a while, listening to the neighborhood settle into its morning sounds. A car starting somewhere down the street, the birds working through their early business in the oak tree outside the window, the particular silence of a house that contains only one person and has made a kind of peace with that fact. Then I got up and stood in front of my closet. I was not trying to impress anyone. I had stopped pretending otherwise years ago. But there is a difference between not caring how you appear and refusing to give anyone a reason to dismiss you on sight. I chose carefully. A deep burgundy blouse that had always sat well on me. Dark slacks pressed. Good shoes, not fancy, but solid, the kind that say, I am a person who shows up prepared. I stood in front of the bathroom mirror and looked at myself the way you sometimes look at yourself when you want to take an honest accounting. 62 years old, a face that had earned most of what was written on it. Eyes that had seen enough to know the difference between things that mattered and things that only seemed like they did. I decided exactly like who I was. Before I left, I went to the drawer in the nightstand, on Marcus's side of the bed, the side I still thought of as his 4 years later, without apology, and found the small photograph I kept there. The two of us at a church function, sometime in the late 90s, standing close together in the way of people who have chosen each other and see no reason to pretend otherwise. He was smiling at something just off camera. I was smiling at him. I tucked it into my purse, underneath my wallet, in my keys, in the same place I had been carrying it for 4 years. Then I picked up my bag, checked the lock on the front door, and walked to my car in the cool October morning air. I told myself it was just brunch, just family, and I almost believed it. Beale Street was already alive when I drove in that morning. Not the late-night version of Beale Street that most people know, the one with the neon signs, and the music spilling out of open doors, and the particular energy of a city that has decided to stop being responsible for the evening. This was the daytime version, quieter, but not quiet. The street going about its morning business, with the unhurried confidence of a place that knows it will still be here long after everyone who came to visit has gone home. I found parking 2 blocks north and walked the rest of the way, the October air cool against my face, the river somewhere behind the rooftops, doing what rivers do, moving steadily forward, indifferent to everything on its banks. Itabena announced itself the way certain places do not, with a large sign or a grand entrance, but with a quality of restraint that communicates to anyone paying attention that nothing inside needs to advertise itself. A dark awning, a discreet address, the kind of exterior that belongs to a restaurant that has never once needed to convince anyone of its own value. I stood on the sidewalk for a moment and looked up at it. Then I pushed open the door and went inside. The first thing was the music. Low, unhurried jazz from somewhere above, not the kind that asks you to pay attention, but the kind that simply occupies the air, the way good furniture occupies a room, present and purposeful, and entirely at ease with itself. The second thing was the light, warm, and selective, falling in pools across white linen tablecloths and the quiet gleam of polished silverware. The third thing was the sound of the room itself, conversation kept at a particular volume, the careful percussion of fine china, the occasional soft laugh that had been cultivated somewhere along the way, to carry exactly as far as intended and no further. I stood just inside the entrance and took it in. I had been in rooms like this before over the years. Not many, but enough to know the feeling, the particular awareness that settles over you when you step into a space that was built by people who look a certain way, for people who look a certain way. And you are aware, without anyone having to tell you, that you are not entirely what they had in mind. The hostess appeared with a practiced smile and the name of our party, and she led me up a short staircase to the second floor where Victoria had reserved the long table by the windows. I saw Deshawn before he saw me. He was standing near the end of the table, adjusting the cuff of his jacket with the small automatic gesture of a man making sure everything is in order before something begins. He looked well. He looked, if I was being honest with myself, like someone I had raised, and someone I no longer entirely recognized, at the same time the way your children can look sometimes when you see them in the context of the lives they have built without you. Near the window on the far side of the room, slightly apart from the main dining area, a man I didn't recognize sat alone at a small VIP table, watching the room with the stillness of someone who had seen too much. I did not look at him for long. There was no particular reason to. Deshawn turned and saw me then. In something in his face moved a brief, unguarded moment of something that might have been relief or might have been the particular expression of a person who has been slightly dreading something and is now relieved that the dreading part is over. Mom. He came towards me and kissed my cheek. His arms around me were genuine. Whatever else was true, that part was always genuine. You look great. Thank you, baby, I said. Victoria materialized at his side, with the seamless timing of someone who had been watching for exactly this moment. Carol, her arms opened in that practiced way of hers, the embrace that lands just right without ever quite meaning it. "I'm so glad you're here." She stepped back and looked at me with warm approval. "You look lovely." She took my arm lightly and guided me toward the table. Past the guests, already seated 10 of them, I counted all of them, belonging in the easy and unthinking way of people who have never had to consider whether they belong anywhere. "Everyone, this is Carol," Victoria announced, in the tone of someone presenting something charming and slightly unexpected. "Deshawn's mother. She's been a nurse for how many years?" "Is it now, Carol, 30-something?" "34, I said. 34 years. Victoria smiled at the table. "She's very dedicated. Very salt of the earth, you know. The kind of woman who just puts her head down and does the work." A warm laugh. "We could all learn something from that, honestly." Salt of the earth. I smiled. I found my seat, the one at the far end of the table, near enough to be present and far enough to be decorative, and I sat down. The guests offered me the polite attention that people offer when someone new has been introduced and they are deciding how much of their interest to allocate. A few questions came my way. How long had I lived in Memphis? Whether I was still working? What part of town I was in? I answered each one. I kept my voice pleasant and my posture straight and my hands folded in my lap, beneath the table where no one could see them. I smiled and answered every question. I had learned a long time ago how to make myself small enough to fit into spaces that weren't built for me. The meal continued, and with every passing minute, something in that room tightened. Not loudly, not in any way the other guests would have noticed. It was more like the pressure you feel before a storm, a subtle shift that your body registers before your mind catches up. I had spent 34 years learning to read rooms, and what I was sensing now, beneath the pleasant conversation and the careful laughter, was something that had been building for a long time and was not finished building yet. Victoria moved through that table, the way certain people move through spaces they have designed for themselves, with the ease of someone who has already decided how everything is going to go and is simply watching it go that way. She spoke. She laughed at the right moments. She steered the conversation with the invisible precision of someone who has spent years learning that the most effective control is the kind nobody notices. And every so often she turned toward me, not always with words. Sometimes it was a brief assessing glance that traveled from my face to my hands to some point just past my shoulder, as if checking I was still in the position she had placed me in. Sometimes it was a small redirect a sentence that began with something about me and ended somewhere that diminished me, delivered so smoothly that the people around the table would have needed to replay it to identify the exact moment the knife went in. I kept my hands in my lap. I kept my face composed. Deshawn sat 3 seats to my left. I had been watching him the way mothers watch their children in difficult situations. Not obviously, but with the peripheral awareness that never fully switches off. He was doing everything the occasion asked of him. But there was something in his posture I recognized from long ago. A stillness that was not ease, but its precise opposite. A body making itself quiet, because it did not trust what might happen if it moved. At some point during the main course, his right hand found the edge of the table. His fingers closed around it slowly, without drama, the way you reach for something solid, when the ground beneath you feels uncertain. The grip was steady and deliberate, and it told me everything about what was happening inside him that his face was working hard not to show. Then, without breaking her sentence, without altering her expression by a single degree, Victoria moved her left hand beneath the table and placed it on Deshawn's leg, not reaching for him, not the gesture of a wife seeking connection. This was something else entirely, a placement precise and deliberate, the way you place your hand on something to keep it from moving. Her palm rested just above his knee still, and certain, and I watched my son's fingers loosen their grip on the table's edge, as if the decision about what to do with his hands had just been made for him by someone else. He did not look at her. She did not look at him. But something had been communicated between them in that silence. Not here, not now. Stay where you are. I looked down at my own hands in my lap, hands that had held instruments and held patience and held the hand of the man I loved as the warmth went out of it. These hands had done things that mattered. I turned my attention back to the table just as Victoria set her glass down. The table settled into its listening posture without being asked. Beside her, Deshawn had gone very still, in a different way, not the stillness of someone holding on, but the stillness of someone who has already let go. "You know," Victoria said, in the conversational tone of someone making a casual observation, "Deshawn's mother has been a nurse for 34 years. A small pause. She glanced at me with that practiced warmth. "She raised him completely on her own, really. His father was a schoolteacher." Another pause. "She did the best she could with what she had." A light laugh shared with the table. "He turned out pretty well, so." The word entered me the way cold enters a room when a door is opened, not all at once, but completely, finding every space and settling there. I heard it the way you hear something said about you, in a language you were never supposed to understand, but have been quietly learning for years. Every loaded compliment, every careful diminishment, every year of it compressed into one small, dismissive, perfectly placed word. As if 34 years, as if Marcus, as if the overnights and the steady hands and the life we had built together, all of it, simply the context for the real subject of the sentence, which was him, always him. And I was just the footnote that explained how he got there. Something settled in my chest, not anger, something quieter and more permanent. The kind of feeling that arrives when you finally understand something you have been circling for a long time, when the shape of a thing becomes clear, and you realize you have been looking at it all along, just not quite directly enough. I thought about 34 years of showing up, about the kind of person who gives herself exactly 10 minutes and then drives home, about what it means to keep your dignity in rooms that were not built to accommodate it. And then I thought, not with anger, not with drama, but with the clarity of someone who has finished being patient, that I had been in this room long enough. I had given this table enough of myself. I stood up, picked up my purse, and decided that my dignity was the one thing she would never take from me. I was already standing when the room shifted. Not loudly, not the way rooms shift in movies, with gasps and turned heads, and someone dropping a glass. It was quieter than that, a stillness that moved. If stillness can do such a thing, a held breath passing from one table to the next, until the entire second floor of that restaurant felt like it was waiting for something none of us had a name for yet. I had my purse in my hand. My chair was already pushed back. I was halfway between staying and leaving, which is a terrible place to stand, too proud to sit back down, too dignified to run. That's when I heard it. "Carol," my name, said the way a person says a name when they've been holding it a long time. Not loud, not urgent, just certain. The way you'd say the name of someone you thought you might never find. I turned. The man who stood was not someone I recognized. He was perhaps in his late 60s, with the upright posture of someone accustomed to long hours on his feet, not from labor, but from precision. His suit was simple and dark, well fitted without being showy. His hair had gone fully silver at the temples, neatly kept. He wore no jewelry except a simple watch on his left wrist, the kind a man keeps not for display, but because it was given to him by someone he loved. He was walking toward me, not hurrying, not hesitating, just walking the way a man walks when he's already made his decision, long before he stood up, long before this morning. Perhaps long before any of us sat down at these linen-covered tables with our coffee and our careful smiles. I didn't move. I wasn't sure I could. The room watched. I could feel it, the slow turn of heads, the pause in silverware, the way conversation died, not all at once, but in little waves, table by table, the way a hymn fades at the end of a service. Even the jazz from the speakers seemed to soften, as though the music itself understood that something was happening that required space. Victoria had not moved. From the corner of my eye, I could see her still at the head of her table, her posture suddenly rigid, in the way a person goes rigid when something unexpected has walked into a room they believed they controlled. Deshawn was watching the man approach. His expression was something I hadn't seen on my son's face in a long time, open, uncertain, like a door left ajar. The man stopped in front of me. He was close enough now that I could see his eyes steady, dark, and carrying the particular kind of tiredness that doesn't come from lack of sleep, but from carrying something too long. He looked at me the way you look at a person when you've imagined this moment so many times that seeing it real almost doesn't seem real. He opened his arms, and somehow, I cannot fully explain it, even now I stepped into them. It was not the embrace of a stranger. That was the part that surprised me most. It felt instead like the embrace of someone returning from a long distance, someone arriving at a destination they had doubted they would ever reach. His arms were firm without being forceful. His voice, when he finally spoke against the silence of that room, was low and careful. "I'm so glad I found you." I pulled back just enough to look at him. My voice, when it came, was barely above a whisper. "I'm sorry. Do I know you?" He shook his head gently. "No, but I know you, and there's a great deal I need to explain." He glanced once at the room, at the watching faces, at Victoria's stillness, at the guests who had stopped pretending not to stare. And then he looked back at me with the quiet authority of a man who had spent decades making decisions in rooms where calm was the most powerful thing a person could offer. "Would you walk with me for a moment?" I looked back once at the idol, at Deshawn, whose expression had shifted from confusion to something more careful, more alert, at Victoria, who had not moved, whose smile, that practiced porcelain smile, had become something else entirely. Not anger, not embarrassment, something closer to fear. I followed the man. He led me to a small alcove near the far window, away from the tables where the morning light came in long and gold, and the noise of the room fell to a murmur behind us. He turned to face me, and for a moment he simply looked at me, as though confirming something, as though checking the face in front of him against a face he had memorized from somewhere else, some other time. Then he spoke. "My name is William Grayson," he said. "Dr. William Grayson. I'm a cardiac surgeon. I've been with the Mayo Clinic for the last several years, though I only returned to Memphis recently." He said it plainly. No pride in it, no performance, just fact. Offered the way a surgeon offers a diagnosis, clearly, because clarity is a form of respect. "I've been trying to find you for a long time, Carol, longer than I care to admit." I studied his face. 34 years of nursing had given me a certain facility for reading people, their discomfort, their deflection, their grief. What I saw in Dr. Grayson's face was none of those things. What I saw was earnestness, the particular undefended kind that belongs to people who have stopped worrying about how they appear and started caring only about what they owe. "Why?" I asked. He was quiet for a moment, not hesitating, gathering, the way a person gathers themselves before saying something that matters, something that has waited long enough. "Because of something that happened a long time ago," he said. "Something I should have found you for much sooner. Something I owe you." He looked out the window briefly at the Memphis morning, at the city moving on without us, the way cities always do. "There's a night I need to tell you about," he said. "A night I think about more than you could know." He said he had something to tell me, something about a night in 2010 that I thought I had long forgotten. He took a breath and began. "October 14th, 2010. The words landed quietly between us, and I felt something shift, not in the room, but somewhere deeper. The way a sound carries farther at night than it does in daylight. The way a date can feel like a door, and you don't know until someone says it out loud, whether you've been on the inside or the outside all along. I waited. It was a Sunday, Dr. Grayson said. Late, close to 11 o'clock. I was already home when the call came in. He looked at his hands briefly, then back at me. The gesture was small, but I recognized it, the way a person looks down before saying something that still carries weight, even after all the years. A man was brought into the emergency ward at Methodist, middle-aged. He came in without much warning. His family said he had complained of discomfort that afternoon. Fatigue, some pressure. The kind of symptoms that are easy to dismiss if you aren't paying attention. He paused. The first physician on call that evening dismissed them. The words were plain. He didn't sharpen them with bitterness or soften them with apology. He simply said what had happened the way surgeons sometimes do, because the facts spoken clearly carry their own weight without needing decoration. The man's condition deteriorated quickly, he continued. Within the hour, what had looked like a manageable situation became something else entirely. And the physician, who should have caught it earlier, wasn't there. I was listening. I was also somewhere far beneath the listening, beginning to feel something. Not a memory, not yet. Something earlier than memory. A texture. The particular feeling of a night that was too long, too quiet, in the wrong places, too loud in others. I pressed my hands together in my lap and said nothing. There was a nurse on the floor that night who wasn't assigned to that case, Dr. Grayson said. His voice had shifted, not louder, but slower, more careful. She was finishing a different shift. She should have been gone by 10:30. He looked at me. But she stayed. Something moved through me. Then, not recognition, not quite. More like the feeling of a word. You know, but can't yet reach. Like standing at the edge of something familiar, in the dark, before your eyes have fully adjusted. She was the one who looked at that man's chart a second time, he said. When everyone else had already moved on, she was the one who saw what the numbers were actually saying, not what they looked like on the surface, but what they were building toward. And she made a decision in about 45 seconds. He held up 2 fingers. She had the operating room prepared, and she called me. The alcove felt very still. Behind us, the restaurant continued its careful murmur, the soft percussion of a Sunday brunch, the low current of conversations that had nothing to do with any of this. I was aware of it distantly, the way you're aware of weather outside a window when something important is being said in the room. I was 22 minutes away, Dr. Grayson said. But by the time I arrived, everything was ready. The room, the team, the window we needed. He let that sit for a moment. That man had 17 minutes. That's what she gave him, 17 minutes between where he was heading and where he needed to be. And those 17 minutes were the difference. I heard the words. I understood them. And underneath the understanding, something was beginning to surface, slowly. The way things surface from deep water blurred at first, and then gradually taking shape. A Sunday night, a long shift, a chart that didn't add up. I had worked so many nights like that, hundreds of them, over 34 years. Nights where the hallway smelled of antiseptic and old coffee, and the particular stillness that settles over a hospital after midnight. Nights where I had stayed past my time because something didn't feel finished, because walking out the door felt like leaving a sentence incomplete. I couldn't place this one. Not yet, not with certainty. But something in the way Dr. Grayson was speaking, the weight he gave to those 17 minutes, the particular pause before the word stayed, told me this was not a story he had told lightly. This was a story he had carried. I've thought about that night many times, he said, about what would have happened if she hadn't stayed, if she had clocked out at 10:30 the way she was supposed to, if she had decided that what wasn't her responsibility wasn't her concern. He shook his head just slightly. But she didn't decide that. She stayed. She looked. She acted. He met my eyes, and for a long time I didn't know her name. The morning light was still coming in through the window beside us, quiet and unhurried, the way Memphis light tends to be on a Saturday. I could feel the texture of that other night still vague, still not fully formed, like a photograph left too long in the developer. Shapes without edges. The sense of something that had been real, even if I couldn't yet see its face. It took me years, Dr. Grayson said. Going back through old records, following threads, there were people who remembered, but only in pieces. A first name here, a shift schedule there. He exhaled, but I kept looking, because that man lived, and the person who made that possible deserved to know it. He stopped talking for a moment. The restaurant hummed softly behind us. Somewhere below, the sound of Beale Street carried on, indifferent, unhurried, the way cities are when they don't know what's happening inside their walls. Then Dr. Grayson looked at me with the same steady, unguarded expression he had worn since the moment he crossed that room. "Carol," he said quietly, "do you know who that man was?" I didn't answer right away. The question hung between us. Do you know who that man was? And I sat with it, the way you sit with something that feels bigger than its words. Dr. Grayson didn't press me. He waited with the patience of someone who has learned that certain things cannot be rushed. "I'm not sure," I said finally. "I worked so many nights." He nodded slowly, as though he had expected exactly that answer. "I know," he said. "That's what took me so long to find you. You weren't someone who kept a record of what you'd done. You just did it and moved on." He reached into the inside pocket of his jacket. The phone was nothing remarkable. He held it out, and I took it with both hands, the way I've always held things that feel important carefully, as though carelessness might cost something. The image was small, a photograph taken from a few feet back, slightly angled, the kind of picture a person takes not for composition, but for keeping. The light was the warm tone of indoor brass under soft hallway lighting. I couldn't make out every detail, but I could see enough. A wall, a mounted panel, names arranged in neat rows, the way institutions arrange names when they want to say thank you without making a ceremony of it. And near the center, 2 names side by side. I brought the phone closer. The first name I did not recognize immediately. A man's name, formal the way names on institutional walls tend to be. The second name stopped me entirely. Carol Jean Simmons. The air left my lungs slowly, the way a slow leak empties something you didn't realize was full. My name, my full name, written the way my mother had written it on a birth certificate 62 years ago. The same name I had signed on 34 years of shift logs and incident reports. On a wall I had never seen. That panel was installed at Methodist in 2014, Dr. Grayson said quietly. A donor recognition wall outside the cardiac unit. The family of the man you helped that night made a significant contribution to the hospital's cardiac program, in his name, and they asked that your name be placed beside his. I looked up from the phone. "Mine," I said. "Yours," he confirmed. The family was specific. They wanted it known that 2 people were responsible for that man's life. Him and the nurse who stayed. I looked back at the screen, at my name, at the other name beside it, and then like a window opening in a room shut too long, the memory came. Not all of it, not with recent clarity, but enough. A Sunday night, a chart flagged as stable and left behind. A man breathing in a way I didn't trust, shallow, uneven. A decision made in a hallway, in less than a minute, because that was all the time there was. The operating room, the preparation, the call to a number on an emergency contact list. I hadn't thought about it in years. It had been one night among thousands. The kind of thing you do because you are a nurse, because there is no one else in that hallway. And so the hallway is yours. I handed the phone back. My hands were steady. 34 years had given me that much. "Dr. Grayson," I said. "Yes?" The family of that man, did they know who I was? What I looked like? He held my gaze. "Yes," he said. One word. But it filled the space between us completely. "They've known for some time. The hospital provided information when the wall was commissioned. A name, a photograph from the staff directory, a general location." The morning light felt sharper now. "His daughter," I said slowly. Did his daughter know? He was quiet for just a moment, the kind of quiet that answers before a word is spoken. "Yes," he said. She knew. I didn't speak after that. I sat with what he had told me and let it settle the way something heavy settles when you've been carrying it without knowing what it was. The years of careful comments, the practiced smiles, the words so left hanging above a table, full of polished strangers, like something that leaves no mark you can show anyone. She had known whose mother I was. Not just Deshawn's mother. Not just a woman who spent 34 years taking orders and never really getting ahead. She had known my name was on a wall in that hospital, that her family's name was there beside mine, that the reason her father had lived to walk her down an aisle to hold a grandchild, to sit at a Sunday table, was because a nurse had stayed past her shift on an October night. She had known all of it, and she had still looked across a brunch table and reduced me to so. I folded my hands in my lap. Outside Memphis continued its unhurried Saturday. The jazz floated soft and unbothered into the alcove. I looked at Dr. Grayson. "Thank you," I said, "for finding me." He nodded. Something in his expression, not pity, nothing close to it, carried the quiet relief of a man who has finally put something down. "I should have found you sooner," he said. I became aware of something behind me. Not a sound exactly. More a shift, the sense of a third person, in a space that had held two. I turned slowly. Deshaun was standing at the edge of the alcove, his hands at his sides, his face very still, the way a face goes, still when the mind behind it is moving fast through things. It is only now beginning to understand. He didn't say anything. He didn't have to. Deshaun had been standing there long enough to hear everything. I watched my son's face, not his posture, not his hands, his face, because that is where the truth lives in a person before they've decided what to do with it. I had been reading faces for 34 years, hospital faces. The face of a family in a waiting room who doesn't yet know what I'm about to tell them. The face of a patient trying to decide whether to be afraid. The face of a man who has just understood something he cannot ununderstand. Deshaun's face looked like that last one. He was standing at this edge of the alcove, exactly where I had turned and found him moments before. He hadn't moved, but something in him had the way a structure shifts before it visibly changes the stress, moving through it quietly, finding the places that we're always going to give first. His jaw was set. His eyes were still. But his stillness was not the stillness of a man who had decided to do nothing. It was the stillness of a man who had decided and was only now choosing how. I had seen that look once before, 30 years ago. Deshaun was 9 years old, and a boy at school had said something about his father's job that wasn't meant to be kind. He had come home that afternoon, quiet in that same way, jaw-set eyes, still the decision already made, somewhere inside him, waiting for his body to catch up. Marcus had sat with him on the porch for an hour. He hadn't told Deshaun what to do. He just sat there, letting his son find the shape of what he was feeling. Marcus always knew when to be still with someone. I wished he were here now. Deshaun turned from the alcove. He didn't storm. He didn't raise his voice. He walked back toward the main dining room, the way a man walks when he is no longer managing himself for anyone else's comfort, not slow enough to be hesitant, not fast enough to be reckless, just steady, purposeful, the walk of someone who has somewhere to be and has stopped pretending otherwise. I followed at a distance. Dr. Grayson stayed where he was. He didn't need to follow. He had already done what he came to do. The dining room received Deshaun. The way rooms receive a change in weather, not all at once, but in small adjustments. The nearest table went quiet first, then the next. Conversations tapered. Silverware stilled. The jazz from the speakers continued indifferent to all of it, but the human sounds in the room arranged themselves around Deshaun's approach, the way water parts around something moving through it. Victoria saw him coming. I watched her see him the precise moment her eyes found his face and read what was there. For just a fraction of a second, something moved across her expression. It wasn't fear, not exactly. It was more like miscalculation, the look of someone who has set a board a certain way and has just noticed a piece has moved that wasn't supposed to move. It was brief. She recovered quickly. That was what years of practice looked like. She straightened slightly in her chair. Her smile returned not the full warmth of the earlier performance, but a contained version of it. The kind designed not to charm, but to manage. Deshaun, his name in her mouth, was a question dressed as a greeting. Is everything all right? Deshaun stopped at the edge of the table. He didn't sit. He stood. The way a person stands, when sitting, would mean accepting a position they are no longer willing to accept. I need to talk to you, he said. His voice was quiet, measured. The kind of quiet that is not the absence of feeling, but its complete opposite feeling, so present and so contained that it requires almost no volume at all. Of course. She gestured to the empty chair beside her, His chair, the one he had occupied all morning, the one she had guided him into, with a hand at his back when they arrived. "Sit down, baby. Let's not make this—" "I'm fine standing." Two of the guests nearest to them had stopped their conversation entirely. The woman across from Victoria glanced once at Deshawn, then at her plate, then found something interesting to do with her coffee cup. Victoria tilted her head slightly. The smile held, but it had tightened around the edges, the way a grip tightens when it senses something slipping. She let a beat pass. 2. The silence of someone who uses silence as a tool, spacing it deliberately, letting the other person feel the weight of it waiting for them to fill it with retreat. Deshawn did not retreat. He said very quietly, "She saved him, Victoria." No other explanation, no context for the guests who were listening. Just those 4 words, landing in the space between them, like something placed down rather than thrown. Victoria's smile didn't break. Not yet. "Honey." She reached for his hand under the table. He moved it away. Just like that. No drama. No announcement. Just a hand shifting 4 inches to the left out of reach. A small motion that took less than a second and changed everything in the room. And I felt it from across the room like a door finally opening. The hand that moved away changed something in the room's atmosphere. Not loudly. Rooms like this one, rooms with linen tablecloths and careful lighting, and guests who had spent the morning being precisely pleasant, don't change loudly. They change the way weather changes indoors. A drop in temperature that everyone feels, and no one mentions a current moving from table to table before anyone has decided what to do with it. Deshawn was still standing. Victoria was still seated. That difference, one standing, one sitting, said more than either of them had yet spoken. She knew, Deshawn said. He wasn't speaking to the room. He was speaking to Victoria, his voice low and even, the way you speak to someone when you want them to understand that this is not a performance, not an argument designed for an audience, but a reckoning meant only for the 2 of them. She knew who my mother was, what she did. She knew whose name was on that wall. Victoria set down her coffee cup. Slowly, deliberately, with the care of someone who understands that every gesture is being observed and is choosing each one accordingly. She looked up at Deshawn with an expression that was almost patient, the expression of a person who has navigated difficult conversations before and believes this is simply another one she can navigate. "Deshawn," his name in that same measured tone. "I think you're upset, and I understand that. But this isn't the time or the place." "Then when is the time?" The question arrived without heat. That was what made it difficult to deflect anger. Can be managed, labeled as overreaction, soothed, redirected. But a quiet, direct question from a man who has stopped performing patience sits differently in a room. It doesn't give the other person anything to push against. Victoria glanced briefly at the nearest table. 2 women sat there. One had lifted her water glass and was holding it without drinking. The other had turned slightly in her chair, not enough to be obvious, just enough to hear better. "We can talk about this at home," Victoria said. Her voice was still smooth, but something beneath it had changed. A new, careful quality, the way a person speaks when they are choosing words not just for effect, but for protection. "In private, like adults." "I'm being an adult," Deshawn said. "I'm asking you a direct question, and I'm asking you to respect the people at this table. Did you know?" The question fell into the room like a stone dropped into still water. Victoria's smile remained, but it had become effortful, in a way it hadn't been before, the kind of smile that has to be maintained rather than the kind that simply exists. The guests at the nearest table had both gone very still. Across the room, a man in a dark jacket had stopped mid-conversation, his fork resting against the rim of his plate. "Deshawn, I love you and I need you to." "Yes or no?" Silence. Not long, perhaps 3 seconds, but in a room where everyone had stopped pretending not to listen, 3 seconds is enough time for an answer to exist without being spoken. Victoria took a slow breath. "It's more complicated than yes or no," she said. Deshawn looked at her for a long moment. The thing I had seen in him at the alcove, that quiet, settled decision, was still there. But something older had joined it now. Not anger. Something closer, to the particular grief of a person who has just been given proof of something they had hoped was not true. "She called me," he said. His voice had dropped lower. "At the shower you threw last spring. She called from the parking lot because she couldn't find the entrance. I walked her in. You watched me walk her in through the front door." He paused, and the whole time you already knew. The word already landed in the room, the way a final piece lands in a puzzle. Not with fanfare, but with the quiet, unmistakable sound of something fitting exactly where it was always meant to go. Victoria opened her mouth, then closed it. She looked at the table, at her coffee cup, at the white linen beneath it, at the small things that had nothing to answer for. The composure she had maintained so precisely all morning, through every careful word, every measured smile, every glance, timed just right, reached the edge of what it could hold. And then it gave. Not all at once. The way things give when they have been under pressure for a long time, first a crack, then the sound of something shifting, then the thing itself coming apart in a way that cannot be walked back. "What did you want me to say?" The smoothness had left her voice entirely. What replaced it was something flat and unguarded, the voice of a person who has stopped editing, stopped performing, stopped managing the distance between what they feel and what they allow to show. "That your mother, the nurse, saved my father's life, and mine couldn't, that she gets to be the hero of that story. While I just what? Send a card, show up at her door with flowers." The room received those words in complete silence. "I did what I thought was right," Victoria continued. The flatness in her voice had a rough quality now. Not sharp, but unfinished. The voice of someone saying something out loud that had only ever lived inside them before. "I protected what was mine. I protected my family. That's what people do." "By doing what you did to her this morning," Deshawn said. It was not a question. Victoria didn't answer. She looked at the table, then at her hands, then at nothing in particular, the specific nowhere a person looks when they have run out of directions that feel safe. She didn't look at me. She didn't look at the guests. At the table nearest the window, the woman who had been holding her water glass set it down without a sound. The man in the dark jacket had resumed eating quietly, with a focused attention to his plate that had nothing performative about it. A younger woman, 2 tables back, had looked up from her phone at some point during all of this and had not looked back down. No one spoke. No one reached across to offer comfort or validation or the social grace that usually rushes in to cover the sharp edges of a moment like this. The room simply held what had just happened inside it, the way a room holds the aftermath of a storm, still and altered and aware. The room didn't gasp. It just went very, very quiet. The kind of quiet that means everyone has heard enough and decided where they stand. Deshawn turned, not toward the guests, not toward Dr. Grayson, who was still standing at the far edge of the room, not toward the window or the door or any of the exits that a person reaches for when a room has become too much. He turned toward me, and I understood in the way a mother understands things before they happen what he was going to do. He crossed the room slowly. I want to say that carefully, slowly, because it matters. He didn't rush. He didn't stride. He walked the way a person walks when they are no longer trying to look like anything in particular, when the performance of composure has been set down somewhere behind them, and what remains is just a man moving toward the person he needed to reach. The room watched him. I felt it, the collective stillness of people who have witnessed something they weren't prepared for and are now holding themselves very quietly, as though any sound might disturb what is unfolding. He reached my chair. He stood there for just a moment, looking at me, the way he used to look at me when he was small and had come home from somewhere that had been harder than expected, not asking for anything specific, just needing to be where I was. Then he folded himself down beside my chair, not beside it, the way an adult stands beside something. He lowered himself slowly, one knee at a time, until he was beside me at my level, and then he leaned forward and rested his head in my lap, the way he had when he was 4 years old and had woken from a bad dream, the way he had when he was 9 and the world had been unkind. The way he had at his father's funeral when he was 31 years old and too old to need his mother in that way, and needed her anyway. I didn't speak. I had learned over the years of raising him that there are moments when words are the wrong instrument entirely. When what a person needs is not to be told anything, not to be reassured or advised or guided, but simply to be held by someone who has known them longer than they have known themselves. I placed my hand on his head. That was all. My hand on the back of his head, the way I had placed it 1,000 times before, when he was small enough to fit entirely in my arms, when he was tall enough to look down at me, when he was somewhere in between, and the world kept asking him to be more than he was ready to be. He didn't make a sound, neither did the room. The jazz had faded at some point, or perhaps I had simply stopped hearing it. What remained was a silence that didn't feel empty. It felt full, the way silence feels when it is holding something too large for words to carry. I kept my hand where it was. I felt his shoulders, the tension in them, the years of holding himself straight and careful and correct, all the quiet effort of a man trying to be good in too many directions at once. Beneath my hand, slowly, that tension began to change. Not disappear, some things don't disappear, but soften. The way something softens when it finally knows it doesn't have to hold itself alone anymore. I thought about the boy who used to sit on the porch steps and wait for me to come home from night shifts, who had learned to make coffee before he was tall enough to reach the pot without a stool, who had folded his father's shirts after Marcus was gone because he said it made him feel like his father was still somewhere nearby. I thought about all the years I had worried whether I had given him enough steadiness, enough warmth, enough of whatever it is that a person needs in order to find their way back to themselves when the world has pulled them sideways. In that moment, with his head in my lap and the whole room holding its breath around us, I thought that perhaps I had. I don't know how much time passed. It doesn't matter, really. Some moments aren't measured in minutes. They're measured in what they carry and what they release. When I finally looked up, the room was still quiet. The guests at the nearest tables hadn't moved, not to leave, not to speak, not to reach for their phones or their coffee cups. They were simply present, witnesses to something they hadn't expected to witness when they sat down to a Saturday brunch and dignified enough to let it be what it was. And then I looked across the room. Victoria was still at her table. She hadn't moved during all of it, not when Deshawn crossed the room, not when he knelt, not during the silence that followed. She had sat with her hands folded in front of her, and her eyes directed slightly downward, the posture of someone enduring rather than watching. I looked at her. I want to be precise about what that looking was, because it would be easy to misread it. It was not anger. I had moved through something on the other side of anger, sometime in the last hour in the alcove with Dr. Grayson, when I had understood the full shape of what had been done and had chosen not to let it make me into someone I didn't recognize. It was not triumph, either. There was nothing in me that wanted to perform victory over this woman. What it was clarity, the simple, clean clarity of a person who has stopped pretending not to see what they see, who has looked at a thing, directly named it quietly inside themselves, and decided that the naming is enough, that she doesn't owe it an audience. I looked at Victoria, the way you look at something you have understood completely and have nothing further to prove about. She felt it. I know she did because I watched her feel it, the slight shift in her posture, the brief upward movement of her eyes before they settled somewhere to my left. Not meeting mine, almost, but not quite. She reached for her bag. She said nothing. She stood, and she straightened her jacket with the automatic precision of someone for whom appearance is the last thing to go, and she walked toward the exit without looking back. No explanation, no parting word, no acknowledgement to the guests, or to Deshawn, or to Dr. Grayson, or to me. She simply left. She left without a word. And I understood then people like her don't apologize when they lose. They just find somewhere else to be. After she was gone, the restaurant felt like it could breathe again. Not immediately. These things don't happen immediately. First there was the sound of her footsteps fading toward the stairwell, and then the soft close of a door somewhere below, and then the particular moment when a room collectively decides that whatever had been holding it taut has finally released its grip. Someone coughed softly. A server appeared from the far side of the room and refilled a water glass without being asked. Two women at the nearest table exchanged a glance. Not conspiratorial, not unkind. Just the glance of people who have witnessed something together and are only now returning to themselves. The jazz resumed, or perhaps it had never stopped, and I was only now hearing it again. Deshaun had straightened up from beside my chair. He was sitting now in the seat next to mine. Not the seat he had occupied all morning across from Victoria, but the one closest to me, pulled a few inches nearer than its original position. His elbows rested on his knees. He was looking at the table, not at anything on it, just looking the way a person looks when they are processing something too large for a single expression. I let him be. I understood that kind of quiet. It was Dr. Grayson who moved first. He had remained at the edge of the room during all of it, through Deshaun's confrontation, through the silence, through Victoria's exit. He had stood where he was with the stillness of a man who understood that what was happening did not require him and had the discipline not to insert himself into it anyway. Now, he crossed the room slowly, the way he had crossed it the first time. Unhurried, deliberate, carrying himself with the particular gravity of someone who has one more thing to say and has waited the right amount of time to say it. He stopped beside my chair. Deshaun looked up at him. Something passed between the two of them. Not words, just the brief, acknowledging look of two people who have both been part of something and understand what it cost. Dr. Grayson pulled out the empty chair across from me and sat down. He folded his hands on the table. He didn't rush into it. He looked at me the way he had looked at me in the alcove, directly, without deflection, with the steady eyes of a man who has decided to be honest, regardless of how the honesty lands. "There's one more thing I need to tell you," he said. I waited. "The night your husband passed," he said. He said it plainly, not gently, the way people say it when they are trying to protect you from the weight of the words. Just plainly, with the respect of someone who believes you are strong enough to receive a hard thing without it being softened beyond recognition. I know about that night. Something shifted in my chest. Not dramatically, not the sharp drop of shock. More, the slow interior movement of something that has been braced against a possibility for a very long time. "I was the surgeon on call that evening," he said. "I was 40 minutes away when the call came through. By the time I arrived..." He stopped. He looked at his hands for a moment, then back at me. "By the time I arrived, there was nothing left to do. The team had done everything that could be done. But I have thought about those 40 minutes many times. Whether I could have gotten there faster, whether a different decision earlier in the evening might have changed how that night ended." The restaurant continued its quiet hum around us. Silverware, soft voices from the floor below, the distant, unhurried sound of a city that had no idea what was happening inside this room. "I didn't know whose husband he was," Dr. Grayson continued. "Not then. I knew his name. I read the file. I did what surgeons do. After a night like that, I went home and I sat with it, and eventually I returned to work. Because that is what the job requires." He paused. "It wasn't until I began looking for you, for the nurse, from October 2010, that I made the connection. The last name, the hospital, the year." He met my eyes, and I realized that the woman I had been trying to find was the same woman who had lost her husband on my watch. I didn't say anything. I had no words ready for that. Not because I was overcome. I had learned over 34 years, and one very long grief, that being overcome is a choice you can defer when you need to. But because there was nothing in me that wanted to rush past what he had just said. It deserved to be heard fully before anything else happened. So I simply sat with it. The weight of that particular night, the Tuesday in October, 4 years ago. The uniform I had worn home, the 10 minutes in the parking deck, had lived in a specific place inside me for a long time. Not at the surface, not something I carried visibly, but present, the way old injuries are present, not always painful, but always there, a slight alteration in how you hold yourself. I had never blamed anyone for that night. That had never been where the weight came from. The weight had come from the not knowing, the wondering whether something different could have changed it, and having no one to ask, and eventually deciding that asking was a door best left closed. Dr. Grayson had just opened it, gently, without being asked, because he had decided somewhere in the years between then and now that I deserved to know. He was looking at me still, that same steady, unguarded expression, waiting for whatever I needed to say or not say, giving me the space that I suspected he wished someone had given him a long time ago. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. "I'm sorry I wasn't there in time." 5 words. I looked at him. As the careful honesty in his face, the tiredness that had nothing to do with sleep, the particular relief of a man who has finally said the thing he came to say. I nodded, once, slowly. It was enough. He said he was sorry he wasn't there in time, and something I had been carrying for 4 years, alone, in silence, finally had somewhere to rest. That afternoon, Deshawn drove me to Methodist. He didn't ask if I wanted to go. After we said goodbye to Dr. Grayson in the parking garage below Ida Bena, he simply said there was somewhere he needed to take me. His voice had the quiet certainty of someone who has made a decision they aren't looking for permission on. I got in the car. We didn't talk much on the drive over. Memphis moved past the windows the way it always does on a Saturday afternoon. Unhurried, sun warmed the streets, carrying on with the indifference of a city that has seen everything and judges nothing. Deshawn kept both hands on the wheel. I watched the familiar neighborhoods pass and let my mind rest in the way it sometimes can after a very long morning. Methodist received us the way it always had, the wide entrance, the automatic doors, the particular smell of the lobby that I had never been able to fully describe to anyone who hadn't spent years inside a hospital. Antiseptic, and something warmer beneath it, the smell of a place that takes its work seriously. Deshawn held the door. I walked through without thinking about it. 34 years had made it automatic. But today it felt different, not heavier, not lighter, just different, the way a familiar place feels when you return to it, knowing something you didn't know before. He seemed to know where he was going. He walked through the main lobby, with purpose turned left at the corridor leading toward the cardiac unit, and stopped in front of a section of wall that I recognized slowly, with a particular kind of recognition, as one I had passed more times than I could count. I had never stopped to look at it, not once. In all the years of walking this corridor, to shifts, from shifts past it, on the way to somewhere else, I had never stopped. It was the kind of thing you walk past when your purpose is always the patient at the end of the hall, not the acknowledgement on the wall beside you. I stopped now. The panel was mounted at eye level, centered between 2 doorways, larger than I had understood from the small image on Dr. Grayson's phone, perhaps 3 feet wide, 2 feet tall, the kind of dimensions that announce themselves as permanent. The frame was dark, polished metal, simple, clean, holding its dignity without asking for attention. Inside, a background of deep, warm bronze, the tone of something meant to endure rather than impress. Across the top, in clean, formal lettering, in grateful recognition. Below that, a single line of smaller text. These names represent individuals whose actions made a lasting difference to the patients and families of the Methodist Hospital Cardiac Unit. And then the names. 2 columns, neat and unhurried, each one given its own space. Donors, staff, people whose contributions had been specific enough, lasting enough to be set here in metal and permanence. Deshawn was reading them. I watched him scan the columns slowly, not skimming for information, but absorbing, letting each name register before moving to the next. His hands were at his sides. He found it. I saw the moment he found it. Not because he said anything, but because he went still, the particular stillness of a person who has been looking for something and has just located it, and needs a moment before they can do anything with the finding. 2 names, side by side. The first was a man's name. 2 words, formal the way names on institutional walls tend to be. Beneath each name, in smaller lettering, a date. October 14th, 2010. The same date. Both of them. Side by side, sharing the same night, the same corridor, the same decision that had stretched into years of consequence neither of them had fully understood at the time. And the second name, Carol Jean Simmons, my name. Full and unhurried, taking up the space it had been given without apology. 3 words that I had written on shift logs and incident reports and the backs of cards left in patients' rooms, here now, in a place that said, without elaboration, this mattered. She mattered. Deshawn stood in front of it for a long time. I did not speak. I had learned, over the course of this particular day, that there are moments when silence is not the absence of something, but the presence of everything that words can't carry. Deshawn was reading and understanding and arriving somewhere entirely on his own, and my job, the most important one I had ever had, was simply to be beside him while he did. He read the date beneath the names. I watched his eyes move from one name to the other, then to the date, then back to my name. He understood. I could see it in the way his breathing changed, barely perceptibly, the smallest shift. But I had been reading this person since before he could speak, and I knew what it looked like when something landed in him completely. He understood that I had walked this corridor for years and never known my own name was here. He understood what it meant that someone had put it here, and what it meant that no one had told me. He didn't say any of that. He didn't need to. He raised his right hand and touched the wall. His fingertips found the letters of my name, the raised metal of them cool and solid and permanent. He didn't press hard. He traced them the way you trace something you want to carry with you past the moment of standing in front of it. The C of Carol, the full curve of Jean, the last name that had been his father's too, that Marcus had given to both of them, and that now lived here on this wall, in a form that would outlast the morning that had just passed and the years that had led to it. He traced my name with his finger, slowly. Then he said very quietly, "Dad would have loved this, Mom. We didn't talk much on the drive home. That was fine. There are kinds of silence that demand to be filled, the uncomfortable ones that grow uneasy if you leave them alone. And then there are the other kind, the kind 2 people settle into because they've been through something together, and filling it with words would be like turning on a light in a room where the quiet is the point. This was the other kind." Deshawn drove with one hand, easy on the wheel. The light had changed since morning gone from sharp mid-morning brightness to something softer, the kind of late afternoon light Memphis does well, falling across rooftops and old oaks until ordinary streets look like they've been given a little more grace than usual. I watched it through the window and let myself simply be inside it. At some point, somewhere between the hospital and the turn onto my street, Deshawn said, without looking away from the road, "He kept a photo of you in his desk at school. Did you know that?" I turned to look at him. "The one from your nursing graduation," he said. "He showed it to his students sometimes. He told them, 'That's my wife. She saves lives for a living.'" I hadn't known that. 38 years of marriage, and I hadn't known that. I looked back out the window and didn't say anything. Neither did Deshawn. Neither of us needed to. "He would have been there today," Deshawn said after a while. "If he could have been." "I know," I said, and I did. That was the thing about Marcus. You always knew where he would have been. He was the kind of man who made his presence so consistent, so entirely himself, that even after he was gone, you could still feel the shape of where he would have stood. Deshawn's phone sat in the cup holder between us. It didn't light up once. He didn't reach for it, didn't glance at it. He just drove, said small, true things about his father, and let the afternoon carry us home. He pulled into my driveway as the light was going amber at the edges. He didn't get out immediately. We sat for a moment, the way you sit at the end of something long and significant, not reluctant to finish, but aware that finishing deserves a beat of acknowledgement. "You going to be all right?" he asked. "Yes," I said. The real way, not the way you say it, to make someone stop worrying, but the way that comes from somewhere, settled, somewhere that has been tested today, and found that it holds. He walked me to the door and hugged me on the porch. A long one, the kind he hadn't given me in longer than I wanted to count. I felt him breathe out against my shoulder, something releasing the way things release when they finally reach the place they were trying to get to. "I'll call you tomorrow," he said. "I know you will," I said. I watched him back out of the driveway and disappear around the corner. Then I stood on the porch for a moment in the amber quiet of a Memphis evening, listening to the neighborhood settle into itself. I walked around to the back garden. It wasn't much. It never had been. A small square of yard with rose bushes along the fence that Marcus had planted the spring after we moved in, insisting every house needed something that came back every year, whether you tended it or not. A bird bath he'd found at a yard sale and spent a Saturday cleaning until it looked like it belonged. 2 chairs, old ones, armrests worn smooth from years of use, facing the fence and the roses, and whatever was blooming or not blooming at any given time. I sat in my chair. Marcus's chair was beside mine, the way it had always been. I didn't look at it directly. I didn't need to. Its presence was enough. The familiar shape of it, the slight lean from years of accommodating the man who had sat there reading the Sunday paper, watching the birds, saying more than once that this was all a person really needed at the end of a day. The roses were winding down, the way they do in late October. The last blooms gone soft at the edges, making their unhurried peace with the coming cold. The birdbath caught the last of the light and held it. I sat with the day, all of it. The morning that had started one way and ended another. The name on a wall I had walked past for years without stopping the hand of my son, tracing letters in cool metal. The weight that had found somewhere to rest after 4 long years of being carried alone. I let it be what it was, not a wound, not a victory, just a day, a hard one, then a true one, then at the end, a peaceful one. I have thought since then about what it means to know your own worth, not to perform it, not to argue for it, or explain it to people who have already decided not to see it, just to know it the way you know your own name. It isn't loud, that kind of knowing. It doesn't announce itself. It just holds. It holds when someone reduces you to a single dismissive word at a table full of strangers. It holds when the years of your life are summarized in a way that leaves out everything that mattered. It holds when you are seated at the far end of a room that wasn't built with you in mind. It holds because it was never theirs to take. It was always yours. The people who tried to make you forget that they weren't your story. They were just the pressure that showed you how strong the foundation was. Some people come into your life to show you exactly where your edges are. And once you know, truly know, nobody can push you past them again. Not ever. If this story touched your heart, I'd love to know where you're watching from and what time it is there. And tell me, has anyone ever underestimated you the way Victoria underestimated Carol? Share your story in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe so you never miss a story like this one.